Now, what I want to talk about today actually builds very much on what Sabina was talking about this morning when she set the stage by talking about 5 forms of reproducibility. Now, I'm going to talk about the first 3 of those 5, and I'm going to talk about it from a slightly different perspective, namely by exploring what I consider to be a tension between reproducibility on the one hand and resilience on the other. And I'll spend the rest of my talk explaining to you what I mean by that. And my basic fundamental principle is that science must not only be reproducible, but it also has to be resilient against outside influences, and it should also be successful. It should generate the maximum amount of knowledge possible. So let me start out with computational reproducibility. This is exactly what Sabina used this morning, the same text, same phraseology, and I want to explore this key condition of computational reproducibility, which is that you've got to have access to the code and the data of other researchers to achieve this. Now, let me first say up front that transparency and open data are essential. I'm not arguing against that. In fact, if you go to my website and to my papers, you will always find a data availability statement with the data at the link. However, we need to have a conversation about the full implications of transparency. And this is something that is happening in a number of fields, in particular in public health, in research on public health, where scientists have a very different attitude towards open data from what we might be used to, for reasons that I will explain in a moment. And indeed, if you talk to privacy researchers, computational privacy researchers, they will also have a very different opinion about transparency. And that is because open data is political. It is political whether you like it or not. I'm going to use American examples here for the most part because that's what I'm most familiar with and where most of the literature is being written. But I think similar considerations apply all around the world. Now, the reason open data is political is because several data access acts in the United States were drafted by the tobacco industry and its allies. You may wonder why. The implementation was overseen by the tobacco industry, and all of the challenges launched against regulations, let's say by the EPA, were launched by industry bodies or lobbyists, not the public. And this is all written up in, numerous articles in the public health arena. And when you then look at this a little more carefully, then what you find is that open data have often been used by, in this case, the tobacco industry, to reanalyze these open data. Sounds great. Let's, make it open and let people reanalyze it. The problem is whenever the tobacco industry is reanalyzing something, then by some funny coincidence, all the ill health effects of tobacco disappear, together with the participants who were suffering lung cancer and heart attacks. So this isn't just tobacco. This is, there's a whole history of this for basically any chemical pollutant or any kind of product that has adverse health consequences. Now, that's just one illustration of how open data can be political. Here's another one that's fairly recent. When the Republicans wanted to pass something known as the Honest and Open EPA Science Treatment Act. Now, again, this is all highlighting reproducibility. They wanted to legislate that the EPA can only use data that can be replicated and that are publicly available. for independent analysis. All the underlying information has to be public. That sounds, I mean, it sounds terrific. Sounds like something, the Open Science Foundation could have written. Now, this bill twice passed the House, but died in the Senate every time, and that's arguably a good thing because the implications of that act would have been that incidents like the Deepwater Horizon explosion or the Exxon Valdez spill could not have been used by the EPA to formulate regulations because you can't replicate it. You can't blow up another platform just to rerun the experiment. And then you can't use the data. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, as it happens, Donald Trump didn't wait for legislation. He just introduced these regulations in the EPA. And for some time, there was a very intense political battle going on about open data in the United States. So that was just a thumbnail sketch of ways in which open data can be weaponized. That's my term for what is going on here. I already talked about the intentions of people who want to reanalyze the data. I mentioned the tobacco industry as one example. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. All I have time for is to briefly talk about consent and ethics. Now, obviously, we all obtain consent from our participants. And we promise them anonymity in the consent forms. And we try to achieve that, which by itself, incidentally, is not at all easy. This is where the computational privacy researchers tear their hair out because they say, your data are not anonymized. I will be able to identify every single participant in these data by cross-matching it with other available public databases. And unfortunately, that is all too true. And if you're an expert, you can very easily do that. But let's put that aside. Let's talk a bit more about consent. Suppose Ms. Jones consents to participate in an experiment that observes the effect of training in working memory on IQ, on intelligence. Working memory is just your ability to manipulate symbols, and it is highly associated with intelligence. So maybe if I train this skill of manipulating symbols, then maybe your intelligence goes up. Now, experimenter is collecting the usual covariants, demographics, gender, ethnicity, age, zip code, maybe, whatever. And all of a sudden, the Ku Klux Klan discovers these open data and discovers that black participants had a higher IQ but benefited less from training. I'm making that up, of course. Maybe the Ku Klux Klan would discover something completely different. But the point is they can discover this if the data are open. And you can then imagine what happens next. I don't have to get into the details. Now, suppose Ms. Jones was black. Did she consent? Did she know that this is what could happen with her data at the time she participated in the experiment? Well, no. Neither does the experimenter. And if this happens a few times, would you ever again get somebody from a marginalized community to participate in your research? And this has nothing to do with anonymity. It's got something to do with the fact that if your data are completely open, you lose control over them. And in our world, that's perfectly fine, because your colleagues from, a French-speaking university in Belgium, if they come and reanalyze your data, well, that's not that bad. But in another world, in my world, I study climate denial and conspiracy theories, among other things. This is a crucial problem because you cannot imagine, unless I tell you, what can happen when people get access to open data. Let me give you one real-world example. You may recall the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland. Thousands of people were killed in what was effectively a civil war. The Belfast Project is an oral history based on interviews with, well, combatants, in other words, terrorists, okay? That's not, let's be honest. These are people who were involved in military action, whatever you want to call it, terrorism. They had first-hand knowledge of bombings and murders. Now, they were promised confidentiality, and they were promised that the interviews would not be released until after their death. So that's a pretty good protection against, being arrested when you're dead. But that's not what happened. The Northern Ireland police subpoenaed these tapes. They were held by Boston College in the United States. There was a prolonged court battle, and for whatever reason, which is outlined in a number of peer-reviewed articles, Boston College handed over the tapes against the protest by the researchers. Guess what happened next? Well, most immediate consequence was that another oral history project came to a screeching halt because no one trusted researchers anymore to keep the data private. And then there were all sorts of other fallouts that are speculative. Well, they actually happened, but they're grayed out because I have no idea whether Jerry Adams was arrested because of these tapes or not. No one knows. Northern Ireland is murky, if nothing else. But that is this is on the record, a case of open data having some adverse fallouts. So what does this add up to? Let me reiterate that I think science should be open and transparent, but that by itself is political. It is a political statement. You cannot escape it. If you're in favor of open data, you're making a political statement. If you deny it is a political statement, that is a political act itself. So we have to be, in my opinion, aware of this, and we require resilience in addition to openness. So, for example, I outlined this in a commentary in Nature some time ago. For example, you can require symmetry, that people who access your data to reanalyze them also have to pre-register their analysis, and they have to submit a proposal, rather than just being given the data to cherry pick over to find whatever it is that the Ku Klux Klan or anybody else wants to find. So, moving on to the second of the 3 points that I want to talk about. This is the second one also from Sabina's talk this morning. This deals with replicability and replicability of experiments. Now, not computational reproducibility, but replicability. In other words, you run the experiment again, you get the same results. Now, that's essential because, in fact, replicability is a line of demarcation between pseudoscience and science. Pseudoscience you can't replicate because whatever they tell you is what they do post hoc and ad hoc to explain whatever the constellation of stars or clouds is in the sky. You cannot replicate that. So replicability is fundamental. And if we have a replication crisis, such as, the famous paper here, that only a quarter or half of experiments in psychology replicate, then that may be a problem. It may be a problem. It doesn't have to be a problem. Because what I'm going to argue for the next few minutes is that for science as a collective enterprise, low replicability of published experiments may be good. All right, now that's a little controversial, so let me say it again so there's no ambiguity. Low replicability is good, okay? It's not bad under certain circumstances. Why am I saying that? Well, I'm saying that based on the following points. First of all, whether or not a finding is considered interesting or meaningful by the scientific community has nothing to do with their replicability. I'll present evidence for that in a moment. That's one principle from which I depart. The second thing that I'm postulating is that what matters is not replicability of a study, but what matters is what science overall achieves as a collective enterprise and how much knowledge, robust and reproducible knowledge, it generates. Now, the moment you accept that, and I'll present evidence for that, you can reframe the replication crisis as a replication market, for lack of a better term. Now, it turns out that you can optimize the outcome of that market by publishing studies that are low in replicability. How? Well, let me walk you through the argument, because I find it quite intriguing. Starting out with one fairly obvious claim, which is that researchers want their papers to be interesting or important, right? Now, I challenge anyone in this room to raise their hand and tell me, oh, I only want to publish stuff no one cares about, okay? I don't think that's true. We all want our research to matter. Maybe not to your grandmother, but to your colleagues or whatever, policymakers, whatever. Now, at the risk of causing great offense, one way in which we can tell whether a paper is interesting is whether or not it's highly cited. A paper that has never been cited is just not important, okay? Now, you can object to citations as a measure, be my guest, but I think we can all agree that if no one cites your paper, that really means no one cares. No one cares enough to cite it. Let's face it. And I would argue that researchers want citations, but do we get them? Well, turns out not as much maybe as we'd like. This is the empirical distribution of citations of the last 2,000 articles that were published in each of these premier journals in psychology in 2018. Now, what you can see is that most papers had 0 citations. That's the modal bar here. And then there's like, 1% that has 200. Here's something going up to 500 citations. But, you're talking about just 1 or 2 papers. Now, why is that if we all want citations? Well, I think the answer is that we cannot predict the marketplace of ideas the same way you can't predict any other marketplace. You can respond to feedback, but you cannot predict what's going to happen. Otherwise, Ford would have not built the Edsel to be followed by the Pinto, the car that explodes on impact. You don't produce bad things if you know ahead of time that no one will like them. And so, what follows from that? Well, what follows from that is that when you publish stuff, you don't know what you're publishing. You have no idea whether it's any good. I mean, you can think you do, but based on my own personal experience, I'm always surprised at how my best papers don't get cited as much. And the ones that some student wrote get cited a lot. So, I'm culpable of this. I don't know ahead of time what is happening. And also, the importance that the field attributes to a paper has nothing to do with their replicability. I have 2 sources of evidence for that. This is a survey of 100 experts who attended a symposium on replicability. So they were self-selected to be interested and to be experts in the field, 100 people. And they were asked which study is more likely to replicate, whether it's widely cited or rarely cited. Now, everybody said equal, pretty much. I mean, that's a pretty clear result, that people pick the middle, that citations don't matter. And the expert judgment was very good, because if you look at the empirical citations of studies in the reproducibility project, you find that replication, whether they replicated or not, was not correlated with the citation count. So again, replicability is independent of importance and interest. Now that's important to establish, those 2 things. Number 1, we can't predict. Number 2, interest doesn't affect replicability. Because now we can pivot. And we can pivot to considering science as a whole. And we can note 2 potential problems with science. One is that you waste experiments if you try to replicate something and it fails to replicate, because you've gone down the garden path trying to build on somebody else's idea, except that idea was built on sand. That's a cost. It's a notable cost. But equally, and this is the crucial point, replicated studies no one cares about also carry a cost, because those experiments are also wasted. Now you may say, oh, well, you know, surely that never happens, that somebody really, you know, that are their experiments bad enough for us not to want to replicate them? Well, I don't know. I had a look around the literature, and here's one that evaluated the impact of lunch on cognition. Do we want that replicated? I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I'm not terribly impressed, but maybe other people are. Purring in 4 cats. Do we want that replicated? Then we get 8 cats. So we now have 8 cats instead of 4 that are purring. Do we care? I don't know. This one, maybe the link between sex and nasal function is something that has to be established more thoroughly. I don't know. But I think you get the point, that there are studies out there that are being published where a lot of people would say, seriously, you want that replicated? Well, if you accept that there's a cost to wasting replication of studies no one cares about, then we now have 2 costs. We can trade them off against each other, and we can now ask, how can we achieve maximum reproducible, robust knowledge gain with a minimum cost? And the moment you do that, this becomes a marketplace that you can optimize mathematically or by simulation or whatever. Let me walk you through an intuitive example. Let's assume in this world, any study replicates only 1/3 of the time. So it's between social and cognitive psychology. Let's furthermore assume that the field as a whole, the community, considers 1 in 10 findings to be interesting. Now, the other 9 are considered interesting only by the person who ran the study, but no one else cares. All right, that's life. Sorry, welcome to my world. That is, the way science seems to operate. So the question now is, how can we maximize outcome? Now, suppose you replicate before publishing. There are now 30 experiments here. Each blue bar is an experiment that was significant. I'm now being very conscientious, and before I publish anything, I replicate them all. Now, it's probably easy to, or best to assume the 30 experiments are done by 30 different researchers, each of whom tries to replicate. And as per my assumption, only 1/3 replicates, which then get published. The others disappear in the dustbin of history. Of those, 1 will be cited, considered to be interesting by the field, which we don't know ahead of time. We don't know which one. Now that means 1 interesting, replicated, robust, reproducible finding required 60 experiments. Hold on to that number, 60. All right. Now, how about we publish everything before we replicate? So 30 different people have 30 experiments. They're all significant. We publish them. Of those, how many will be attempted to be replicated because the field finds them interesting? Well, only 3, because we say only 1 in 10 is considered to be interesting. Now, of those 3, only 1 will replicate, because replicability is only 1/3. And that then is our single replicated, robust, interesting finding that science as a collective has achieved with 33 experiments as opposed to 60. So that is the basic message. We wrote a paper a few years ago, 2 years ago, I think, where we, wrapped a whole simulation around this with lots of different, we explored the space, and the result is always the same. If you publish stuff that doesn't replicate, science overall generates more knowledge. And it does so, or it's important that it does so, because in a world of finite resources, wasting your time replicating stuff no one cares about is not fruitful. And by the way, there are other people who've made similar arguments, not quite the same, but similar arguments, for a cost-benefit analysis of replications. Now, there's one other thing about what I'm saying here that actually is, to my mind, a very strong positive. And that is that if you publish things, a single experiment, you don't know yet whether it replicates, then anybody who likes it enough to replicate will be somebody else. And now it turns out that in this expert survey I mentioned before, every single expert out of 100 thought that a replication in a different lab is more informative than the author doing it themselves. Not a single expert thought it is better for you to replicate your own stuff than for somebody else. Now, of course, if you publish things that may not replicate, then the only way whether you'll find out that they replicate or not is by somebody else. But then you already have an advantage. Now, there are also problems to this model. Very briefly, it's hard to publish replication failures. These uninteresting, unreplicated studies may still pollute. We also have to look at the cost of who bears the cost of failed replications, who benefits. There may be some seniority aspect to this. It may be gendered. There may be all sorts of problems that we have to talk about. But the fundamental fact remains that for science as a whole, low replicability may be a good thing. So how do we move on from here? Well, this is addressing some of the problems that were mentioned this morning about, credit for replication. There is not enough credit for replication. Okay, fine, let's change the publication system. How about this publication system, where you begin by publishing a provisional study that's embargoed? It cannot be cited, it cannot be given media coverage, but there is an invitation to others to replicate this, who then become co-authors. So it's a market-based system. Hey, here's my idea in one experiment. Do you like it enough to replicate? Now, if no one during the embargo period wants to replicate, you still keep that publication. It becomes archival. But it has a note attached to it saying, no one wanted to replicate it. Now, if it is being replicated, then that also becomes the publication of record, and the replicators become authors. So they inherit part of the idea, and it is known that this replicates. And a failure leads to withdrawal of the provisional publication. That's just a thumbnail sketch of a different way of publishing, and if we want to be creative about this, then that is a way forward that I think can solve a lot of problems, including taking what we call a crisis and actually saying, well, that's exactly the way it should be. But we need a different system to exploit that so we don't pollute the landscape with too many things that don't replicate. Let me turn to the final point. What Sabina called semi-standardized experiments, which I would like to call discovery-oriented research. Now, I'm now pivoting slightly from a purely data-based or empirical approach to one that involves theory. Now, it turns out that theory is absolutely crucial and underappreciated in the whole notion of reproducibility. Now, let me define what I mean by discovery-oriented research. Discovery-oriented research deals with theories that imply the existence of a whole set of phenomena, but they don't specify when a particular phenomenon X will or will not be observed. They just say, out there somewhere on this landscape, there are findings that I'm predicting. For example, before the example, I have to complete my bullets here. If X is then observed, the theory is supported, rah-rah, I predicted it. If it fails to be observed, nothing happens, because the theory says, oh yeah, well, I expected it to be out there somewhere, but if it's not here, who cares? Look over there, right? So there is no immediate feedback to the theory. And the precision of the research goals, using Sabina's language from this morning, is low. So here's the example. This is sort of a pseudo example, but it does connect with existing social psychology, something called embodiment priming theory. Again, we kind of made this up for the purposes of the argument, but you go to the literature, you'll find things that sound a lot like this. The idea is, according to this theory, abstract concepts in our heads are grounded in bodily states or actions. So if you induce a bodily state, then that is priming the associated concept. So it might have observable consequences. So here are some predictions or expectations or experiments that you could derive from that theory. You could say, oh, okay, right, if I jump over a gap in the floor, I commit a leap of faith, and that leap of faith may trigger my spirituality, and I may become more religious momentarily. So that could be a potential outcome. Or if I turn a crank clockwise as opposed to anti-clockwise, this primes the concept future, and hence I become more open to experience. All right, now the crank thing actually has been done, as far as I know, and guess what? It doesn't replicate, which is sort of the point of these examples. Now, we published an article on this a few years back where we looked at the implications of discovery-oriented research on replicability. And here's the important point. This is the most important bullet point in this part of the talk. We're talking about studies that have a perfect methodology, sufficient statistical power, no questionable research practices, a conservative alpha. We're talking about the ideal world of, you can even pre-register. You can do whatever you want. Do the best you can. Run the study. Well, the replicability of discovery-oriented research using some plausible assumptions, which I don't have time to spell out, is only about 0.5. That has nothing to do with statistics. It has nothing to do with questionable research practices. It is simply a consequence of weak theories. Now let's compare that to theory testing research. Now the theories we're talking about here are strong. A strong theory specifies that X must be the case under conditions specified by the theory. For example, in memory, temporal distinctiveness theories of memory, they predict that extending the retention interval, the time between study and test, that if you make that longer, all other things being equal, you must forget, okay? Now, that's sort of, trivial, but it is important because the theory inevitably predicts that. So if X is observed, X in this case being forgetting, then the theory is supported. If X fails to be observed, then you don't just go on, because then you have a falsification of a prediction, unlike discovery-oriented research. And in that tightness of the link between discovery-oriented research and theory testing research, that difference translates into a replicability of a study under otherwise identical conditions that is far greater than that for discovery-oriented research. So having a strong theory enhances replicability. It enhances replicability. And that, I think, is a fairly important insight because it has nothing to do with the data or statistics or your methodology. It's the underlying theory. Now, why should you trust me on this, and where on earth did I get those numbers from? Well, I got them from some magic called Bayesian statistics, and this is the magic in its entirety, and I don't have time to go through it, but it's in the article, of course, and fully reproducible. All you got to do is work through our examples and see if we made a mistake. So far, no one has found a mistake. So what does this add up to? This adds up to some interesting implications for reproducibility. The first thing this entails is that if you run experiments that are predicted by strong theory, you shouldn't replicate them. Why? Because to enhance your confidence in the theory, the best thing you can do is test further predictions rather than replicate one prediction that was successful. So their replication is actually counterproductive. If you take the posterior probability of the theory being true as your criterion, and of course, that is one thing scientists do. We're trying to establish theories. You want to establish a strong theory, do not replicate. Explore different predictions. And again, the math is out there. I don't have time to go through it in detail, but, well, look it up for yourself if you don't trust me. For discovery-oriented research, on the other hand, you should replicate. If you leap somebody jumps over a gap to become religious, you find that, then the first thing you should do is replicate that. And on the basis of what I said previously, actually the best thing you should do is ask your friend to replicate it in a different lab. There you need replication, exact replication, to enhance the confidence in the finding. And now what's very ironic is, this is precisely the opposite of what happens often in discovery-oriented research. Because in discovery-oriented research, if something doesn't replicate, then there's always, well, it was a conceptual replication. That means I found an effect over here that was different, but similar enough for me to claim that it was a conceptual replication. And you do that often enough, and then you have ego depletion or something that ultimately then turns out not to be correct. So let me try and wrap up. Reproducibility is an essential attribute of science. Let me say this very clearly, because otherwise people may walk away and say, Lewandowsky said you shouldn't replicate. Yeah, well, I did say that, but I also said reproducibility is an essential attribute. But so are knowledge production and resilience. That is, being able to do science without influence by lobbyists and politicians and industry. And if you also consider resilience and knowledge production, then all of a sudden, the issue of reproducibility becomes one that's pretty nuanced, and it's about trade-offs between competing attributes that have to be acknowledged and discussed. And sometimes those trade-offs can be counterintuitive at first glance. For example, if I claim correctly, I think mathematically, that low replicability can be good for science. Okay, and thank you very much. I stuck to my timing magically and look forward to your questions. I think we do have time, 2 minutes. I don't actually know what's next, but yeah, if there are questions. Yeah, Lloyd. Sure. Of course. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Sure. 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 Yeah. Sure. Well, yeah, except, okay, let me respond to that empirically. Mendel, the case of Mendel is known as a sleeper. And you can analyze sleepers. How many sleepers are there in the history of science? And there is literature on this, bibliometric literature on this, looking at, how many articles who are never cited for 20 years or 30 years or 10 or whatever, how many of those will wake up and all of a sudden become, the sort of revolutionary new genetics. And the answer is, it's a number that's almost indistinguishable from 0. Okay? So, and this is looking at it large scale, not Mendel, but, 20, 30, 40,000 publications. All you got to do is look at them over time and see, if they were how many papers published 30 years ago that have never been cited all of a sudden overturn a paradigm. The number is infinitesimally small. So, I don't think that argument is statistically particularly strong. Now, your other argument about, that it's the sort of unpopular, never cited theories that change paradigms, and they should be given, preference or something. Well, but how do you know that? if no one pays any attention to them? I mean, I don't like citations in many ways, but I think as an indicator of whether anybody is paying attention to a paper, there's a big difference between 0 and let's say a dozen citations. And if you don't like citations, then you don't even need citations in this. All you need to accept is that there are some findings that are being published that are of less interest to the community than others. The moment you accept the gradient of that, the result follows, whether you use citations or not. The result that I presented disappears only if you assume that every single study published is of equal interest to the field. So think of the cats before you commit to that being the case. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a gradient of interest. Yes?